Thank you all for coming to this particular session. I, as Saskia said, have been very lucky to be involved in the field of autism for the 20-odd years that my son has had a diagnosis. And it's been a real privilege to meet such a wonderful group of people as is the autism community with all its differences. I'm not so familiar with colleagues from Europe, and that's my failing, and also the English are famously bad at other languages, so thank you, all of you, for listening if English isn't your first language. I came to be interested in the treatment versus acceptance debate really when my child was very, very young, because as Liz said in her presentation, every single day one is confronted with ethical questions, I believe, as a parent of a child with autism and severe learning difficulties, in my son's case. When to push and when to let him be. Parents of neurotypical children have that to a certain extent. I mean, for example, I needed to be pushed to get out of bed every morning to go to school. I needed to be pushed to remember to have a bath often enough. And that was someone who didn't have communication difficulties in the same way as my son does. My son hated transitions, but we knew that if we helped him overcome his aversion to getting out of the car and go on a swing in the local park, he would be in heaven. He would just be full of joy at swinging, even though his resistance to getting out of the car was enormous. So again, even then, as a mother of a very young child, when do I push him or treat him, intervene? When do I accept he's making a choice, he doesn't want to get out of the car? Now, that's a sort of minuscule little picture of a day-to-day ethical debate. But as I got more involved in the autism world more broadly, I came to realize there were massive ethical debates at a sort of larger scale in the way that Saskia has said. Should we be celebrating autism as a difference, or should we be seeing it as something that contributes to suffering? And people would talk about how their children suffer through not being able to communicate, through sensory overload, seeing autism something that causes suffering, through to autistic people saying, it's your attitudes that cause me suffering. It's the inappropriate environment that causes suffering. And this was played out in the national media in the UK in what one journalist in The Independent called the treatment versus acceptance debate, a bitter ideological war. And the extent of the bitterness was also played out, for example, in the debates about applied behaviour analysis, where online debates have to be moderated really heavily, and there are literal exchanges of death threats on either side. I mean, the passion and the bitterness behind some of these debates cannot really be overstated. Some of the debates mirror what we have called the medical model versus social model of disability. If we look at suffering, is it caused because of a condition within someone, their disability, or is it caused because society out there hasn't yet adapted or understood the condition? The wheelchair analogy, is the mobility problem of the wheelchair user solved by the wheelchair? Well, yes, often it is, but only if society puts up the ramps as well. And there's a huge debate in disability studies and sociology around whether we should locate the problems within the individual or society at large. Within autism, the bitterness and the polarization was seen to be so heartfelt because the logical consequences of either side seemed to be so repellent. On the one hand, the treatment, prevention, cure side of the argument, taken to its logical conclusion, was seen as saying there will be no more autistic people in the world. If you cure people with autism, or indeed if you prevent autism, it means there is a world with no autistic people. And a countdown to genocide was launched in America on the internet in response to somebody saying, within 10 years, we will have discovered the causes of autism and we will be able to prevent it. For some people, this was an attack on the very existence of autistic people. On the other side, the repellent consequence of acceptance, that was usually voiced by parents saying, do I just accept that my child, for example, has pica or pica, the desire to eat possibly harmful objects? I was talking to a parent the other day whose child has to be watched 24/7 because she loves eating glass objects and has had to be hospitalized. And that parent will say, if I just accept this, my child will die. It's absolutely obvious that I can't accept. And acceptance, in a less extreme example, is cited in the education debate. Some will push, will teach, will instruct, will intervene quite rigorously. Others will say we must accept the child's own learning style. And some parents say, well, look, my child was just left to look at the fish in the fish tank every day at school for an entire year. Accepting their autism meant they learnt nothing, and they might as well have been at home. I was really worried about these polarizations because I could see that underneath, people were coming from a place of concern for the autistic person. In other words, in medical ethics, which I then decided to study as a result of all of this, the beneficent motivation, the desire not to harm people, but to actually help them. That underlying a spectrum of people's concern about autistic people, they were advocating really what seemed to be polar opposite goals for autistic people. And I felt also that by voicing these goals in such global terms, we were all missing out on nuance and context. The context, for example, of whether I should almost forcibly encourage my young child to get out of the car because I know he will love being on the swing in 30 seconds' time. And that's what I've said, that people were concerned, but there were different ideas of how we achieve the best for autistic people, and the need, therefore, to delve much more closely into whether when people are using certain language, they really mean that language, whether there might be some hidden common ground that our mutual communication difficulties are causing us, and therefore whether we can get rid of some of the misunderstandings and see what's left in the way of debate, or maybe some common ground to move forward together. In my research, I looked, first of all, at prevention. And I'm not going to dwell on this today. Just believe me, it's really complicated in moral philosophy. Endless articles, heavy-duty literature around the rights and wrongs, especially of antenatal prevention, including, of course, the abortion debate, but that's only one. I just identified categories for potential prevention, and there were 4, and I'm not going to go into any detail, but feel free, I can make this available at another time. What I concluded was concerning prevention, be it pre-birth or in early infancy, that even for those who feel autism is, on the whole, a bad thing, there are many ethical questions to be addressed before we can just glibly say, oh, let's try and prevent autism. There are so many scenarios around prevention that beg so many ethical questions. And this is a problem because certainly at the beginning of my research, people would tell me, and I would read, prevention was often used as a justification for getting grant funding for scientific research. People would write forwards in textbooks saying, oh, knowledge is improving, one day we'll be able to prevent autism, hurrah, kind of thing. And actually, looking at it all, it is, as I'm sure we all agree, likely to be far more complicated than that. And it's very offensive. to a lot of people, the people who see it as countdown to genocide, just to glibly use a word that is so offensive to some people is just, well, we need to be more careful how we use language. I didn't say it quite like this because it was an academic thesis, but now I'm just talking as me. Looking then at cure, what are the ethical issues around cure? The next thing I wanted to do was look at how we might interpret cure of autism. And to do this, I thought of how to categorize how society responds to autism. And I put forward 3 categories of intervention that happen once an autistic person is in the world with us, once a baby has been born or once their autism has been diagnosed. And the first category I referred to was number 1, where all of someone's autism is tackled in an intervention. Calls for treatment of autism imply you're going for the whole thing. You're aiming to get rid of autism or remove all autistic symptoms. And certainly outcome studies that said so-and-so is now indistinguishable from their typical peers implies, oh, it's a good thing just for someone to stop being autistic. Secondly, and I think this is probably the bulk of interventions that are actually practiced, there are those interventions or therapies where people aren't claiming that they're going to remove someone's autism or they're going to stop them being autistic. What they are saying is, well, there are some problems that autistic people have and we can help with those problems. And I would suggest that speech therapy is one of those interventions that says, let's try and assist somebody with some of the difficulties they have with communication. And I've given some examples, and I know these are controversial because I have put progressive applications of ABA, and I know some people feel that that's just a contradiction in terms, but we might want to talk about that later in the debate. The third category of intervention doesn't target the individual at all. Whereas 1 and 2 are saying there's a problem for the individual, we'll work with the individual to support them. The third category is about the wider environment. The analogy, again, would be that building the ramps for the wheelchair users. It's also, for example, anti-bullying initiatives. If we're worried that autistic people are going to get bullied, we might want to hone in on strategies where they learn to rebuff the bully or learn social skills, but we might also want to think, right, there's a bullying problem in this school, and the bullies are going to have some consequences which will intervene against their bullying behaviour. So those were the 3 categories, which I summed up here in the red, blue and yellow circles. I'll be coming back to these, but that's just an aide-memoire for now. I concluded that the first one, that is aiming to take away autism in its totality, is not ethically justifiable. Why? Number of reasons. First of all, it's just the sheer fact that autism is a moving target. Our definition of autism has changed over time. Some very high-powered people like Chris Gilberg and Eric London are saying we don't really know what autism is. And if you don't know what it is, then aiming to cure it seems a bit, or prevent it, seems conceptually quite a challenge. So that's at a purely conceptual level. Then there's the heterogeneity. Some people, as referred to earlier, say, we can see that people with Asperger's have a lot of talents, they can contribute to society, they can get married, they can have a good life, but then what about the people with autism who maybe have really distressing self-injurious behaviour, who seem to be permanently unhappy, who are locked in their own worlds and so on? Surely that sort of autism is a terrible thing, and maybe we should just attempt to take that away. Even if we agree with that, I'll come to that later, you still have to then say, well, it's not autism in its entirety that we should be addressing. It's more individualised and nuanced. The next reason why I felt that number 1 was ethically problematic was the message it sends. And I'm so grateful to have had the opportunity to meet so many autistic colleagues since I've been involved in this world, because there is absolutely no way the world would be a better place if they weren't here. Oh, those of you who are autistic, I'm really glad you're here. Colleagues here. So I just can't say I want to take away autism. It's an honest felt perspective, but there are more academic reasons why I could couch this in language, but I'm speaking now as someone, regardless of my PhD, rather than because of it. There is one issue that people get confused about, and that's comorbidities. I was talking to a paediatrician who works with the gut problems of autistic kids, and when I said I was researching what I was researching and said I didn't feel we should prevent or cure, he said, but these kids have such terrible comorbidities, they suffer so much. And we have learned today also about the comorbidities to do with anxiety and depression. And we know about epilepsy, the higher chances of having epilepsy if you're autistic. And these are very real conditions, and they do cause suffering. Here is where the analogy issue is very important. If we see autistic people as a group of people, some of whom are susceptible to some conditions, what should we do? We should probably treat the condition, the epilepsy, the bowel problem, the anxiety. That doesn't mean to say we get rid of the whole group of people. And my analogy here is in honor of those of you who might be from Southern Europe, from Mediterranean peoples who have a higher chance of getting beta thalassemia. This is a condition that does need treating, very serious, but no one has suggested that the way to get rid of beta thalassemia, or the way to treat it, is to say there will be no more people from the Mediterranean climate. I could be even more extreme in my analogies and say, well, we could eliminate gynecological problems by getting rid of women. If we see autistic people as a legitimate group, rather than just as isolated individuals who are afflicted, then I believe this analogy holds good. There are many good reasons to treat the comorbidities, but let's not confuse that with being autistic. I've got to give up now. There are many ethical challenges around postnatal intervention type 2. That's where we look at the individual. I've listed some of them. These are really important and interesting issues, and we need to be thinking about that because, as I said, most interventions probably are around 2. And I've yet to meet an autism activist who doesn't say, yes, there are areas in which we need support. The limitations around 1 and 2, of course, are, as has been said earlier on in various speeches, they're all about the deficits, they're all about the problems. One of the big climate change necessities, I believe, is that we mustn't forget the positives of autism. And I include that for my son, who is severely learning disabled as well. He is capable of great joy, as well as having problems. A lot said about autistic strengths, quite rightly. I think autistic pleasure is something that neurotypicals forget about. And Helen Keeler spoke about her daughter. She has problems, but when she flies, she soars. This is a woman who was refused. She wanted to donate an embryo. She was refused because she had a daughter with Asperger's. And she felt this was grossly unfortunate. Number 3, the social, political, climate change is least controversial in that most people, wherever they stand, would not be averse to saying, let's create more autism-friendly opportunities. I would say more about that maybe later. So coming back to that, and I really am coming to the end now, just to remind you where we got to. Tackling someone's autism in total, helping them with individual problems, or focusing on social and environmental policy change. 3 distinct groups, but in practice, what we find is that a lot of people use the language of 1 when actually they mean 2. They say, but it's so awful because of epilepsy, when they actually, what they really mean is, I want to treat the epilepsy. They don't necessarily mean, I want this autistic person not to be autistic. Likewise, with number 3, we can all call for autism-friendly provisions, but actually when it comes down to the nitty-gritty, we usually then get into, well, what type of provision? What type of school? What type of increased social support should we give? Which then moves us over to somewhere in 2, because you're still about helping individuals. So I believe that it's the green area, where 2 and 3 overlap, that there is an urgent need for discussion and conversation and coming together. And that if we can change our language and forget about the horrible polarization, extinction versus neglect atmosphere that we interpret the other side as believing in, if we can set aside those feelings and then agree that the green area might be a fruitful area of discussion, we might really make some headway in working out what are useful, helpful, empowering interventions at a societal and at an individual support level that we can all agree about. Some big questions that I think we could discuss within the green area. And this is what I hope will come as a result of discussions in the green area. I would like to think that prevention and cure would be consigned to the dustbin as concepts, whereas issues of support, respect, relevance would come to the foreground. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Saskia. I've entitled my talk Between Cure and Acceptance. Much on this first slide has already been covered by Virginia, so I'll go quickly here. But just to say that obviously my voice is that of an interventionist. I'm a doctor. I've spent 25 years working with people with autism, their families, and trying to understand the development and how one can best help. And this debate is really important to me in terms of how we might be able to understand each other and each other's position. Virginia's talked about the cure sort of pole of this. I do think it's in a sense, a false dichotomy, but of course, like all these things, there is an extreme at one end. Some postnatal interventions, I do think, have treated autistic characteristics as if they should be eliminated. I think some of the early radical behavioral treatments were of that kind. I'm going to try and present something which I truly believe is very different to that as an approach. Virginia brought up the issue of prenatal prevention, and my only comment would be that really the prospects of this in reality are really totally remote, in fact, in my view, except for a very few known specific causes, such as mums taking anticonvulsants in pregnancy or rubella. And those are things that one could think about, which are highly associated with later autism-like development. Acceptance. This is a word, of course, used in lots of different ways. Certainly a respect for individual difference. I hope I can get this across. Acceptance instead of intervention, well, I hope not. That wouldn't really figure with my experience of families and individuals who come with needs in my clinical practice. And I also just want to say as a developmentalist, because this is where I'm really going to be coming from, that of course, for all of us, including autistic individuals and neurotypical individuals, our identity and characteristics evolve through development. I believe that, and I hope I can get some of that across. So I totally lean towards the acceptance pole of this debate, but I trust and hope that doesn't mean that we can't fashion interventions that aren't useful and ethical and acceptable to the community. What do I mean by ethics? So I come at this from a kind of medical perspective, I guess. What's an ethical intervention? Well, for me, it's one where the intent behind the intervention is very clear and transparent and shared with people who might be participating in it. The intent matters to me, what one's trying for. And then, of course, the balance of benefits against harms, and Virginia talked about that. And, of course, then the issue of informed consent and choice for people taking part. No one should have to take part in anything that they don't wish to. Of course, the issue about intervention with young, very young people, young children, is always an issue in paediatrics, child health, including in this area, and that's really where I've worked in. So, of course, there's an issue there about parents giving consent on behalf of young children. That's true. So, for me, an ethical approach is to be clear and transparent about the intention, and importantly, to carefully test any intervention for evidence of benefits and harms. And I mean really carefully test that, using scientific method, but also co-construction with families and individuals with their input and feedback, both at the design and interpretation phase. And as Liz was talking about in the previous plenary, the whole research practice is moving on pretty fast in that respect. And then, of course, we offer an intervention for informed consent and take up if wanted. It's a matter of choice, but I hope that interventions that are offered will have those evidenced aspects behind them. And that's not always the case, of course. In fact, quite often it's not the case at the moment. So what is my intent as an intervener? I want to be transparent about this and open it for discussion, because this is what I've been working on for 25 years. So I'm a developmentalist. The first work I did was to study the development of babies, neurotypical babies. And one of the things that I've been very preoccupied with colleagues is the study of autism development, the development that precedes autism, as well as all sorts of other developmental trajectories. And in this arena of development, we understand this idea of the transactional model. This is, in a sense, very simple. As Virginia said, it would be probably uncontroversial that later in life, if we have an environment that is best fitted around the characteristics and abilities and predilections of an individual, a responsive adaptive school, for instance, can transform an individual's progress and feeling. And what we've tended to do in our work in preschool is to use this notion of goodness of fit between the environment and the individual, developing individual, in relation to the early environment of the individual, which is often within a family or early educational environments. And this kind of transaction idea, this idea of goodness of fit, means adapting the environmental input to the characteristics of the individual. And you can only do this properly if you really pay attention and respect those individual characteristics. In other words, respect unique characteristics and difference. And that is an absolute fundamental aspect of intervening in this kind of philosophic way. So this implies a complete respect for difference, neurodiversity, individual diversity amongst all human beings and all children, including those who have autism development. This idea applies importantly both to neurotypical but also to early autism development. And I think the same developmental processes are essentially at play, and that's the basis of the kind of work we do. Just because the processes are similar, it doesn't mean the what actually happens and the outcome is necessarily similar, but there's aspects of this goodness of fit are important. So, in neurotypical development, research over many, many years, decades, has suggested that if you have a good fit, and of course, I haven't got time to go into this, but we can talk about this more in discussion, but a well-adapted environment to the needs of the baby and the young child, that this enhances or acts to enhance social development, engagement, emotional well-being, and family well-being. This is in neurotypical development. And essentially, we think the same is true in autism development. It doesn't mean you have to do the same adaptations, but the same principle is in play. And also that the same outcomes are desirable, that we should be hoping that all children in our community can have as good social relationships as they can have, feel emotionally as well-being as they can within families that also have good well-being. So that's our intent, is to work with parents, because the work we do works with parents. We don't work directly with children, we work with parents to help them, allow them to improve the goodness of fit with the particular early social communication style of their autistic child. And that's a challenge for many parents, is to actually adjust themselves to the particular style of communication that children with early autism present. But it matters that they can do that. That is the basic idea that we have. If we're able to do that successfully, and we in our work with parents using video feedback to help sensitize them to the needs of the child and respond in an appropriate, sensitive way to their communications and the intent of their communications. If we're successful in that, theory should be that for children with autistic development, actually their social relationships, their competence, their confidence, their emotional well-being should also improve in the same way. That's the, as it were, the wager, the hypothesis of the work. And the question then, ethically, if you like, in the current debate about neurodiversity is this a paradox for autism? Is such a change, if we're able to achieve it, likely to enhance rather than diminish a child's life and personality? The idea behind this work is to support strengths and not to challenge them, or to challenge our autistic identity. I believe that strongly. So that, to me, is a paradox, something for debate. We've been working on this kind of work for many years, and this debate is a good one to have. The questions matter, particularly now, because after many years of work in, for instance, the group that I'm part of, but also other groups around the world on this kind of developmentally orientated intervention, we are beginning to be able to show positive effect in the way that we posited, theorized that we might get. We've been able to show that this works, and we're also able to show how it works in terms of the mechanism, the processes of development. And that's done within scientific trials. So we're beginning to show that we can change things. And that, of course, begs then the question of the nature of change and how we can understand that together. We don't know how much we can change things. It's certainly not going to be a cure in a sense of eradicating autism. That's not the aim, and it's totally unlikely. What this is about enhancing and optimizing developmental progress as far as we can. To enhance social engagement, effectiveness, relatedness, very important, and well-being. And that's the same, from my point of view, as for any child. I want to treat children with autism in the same way. They deserve the same outcomes as far as I'm concerned. So in this sense, a child with autism, in my mind, is no different to any other child in the principles of what I hope for him or her. The issue for intervention is that an autistic development requires particularly sensitive, knowledgeable environmental adaptation to make these good outcomes happen. They can happen, but it needs really carefully approaching. And that's what we try and do, and I think it's continuous with the kind of social level adaptation that happens later in childhood. Might working in this way, as some people have said, might working in this way take away autism's strengths? I profoundly actually believe not, but in the end it's an empirical question, I believe. It's something we test, we can look at, and we can see how the outcomes actually work. So a lot of this needs discussion between us, but a lot of it is soluble within scientific method and really careful study, and we should be able to understand these things better. Thank you very much. There's some of my contact details and references of publications. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right. You see on my title slide 2 images. One represents autism as the big question mark, the puzzle to solve. The other represents autism as a spectrum, as a given consisting of infinite variety. These are 2 commonly used images used by diametrically opposing views, but are they actually in opposition? Note, I'm not saying they're not, but it's complicated. Now, some things I'm about to say, others before me here have said before. And so far, I found that for such a hot debate, there has been a remarkable amount of agreement. So, to keep the debate going, I'm going to mention a couple of things I disagree with that I've heard in plenary talks earlier today. Now, I'd like to divide this in 5 parts. First, a bit about my background. Second, something about stereotyping and pathologization. Third, the definition of autism. What is it anyway? And 4, further discussion of the cure versus acceptance dichotomy. And then the conclusions, hopefully all in 15 minutes. Now, can you all hear me? Okay, thanks. A bit louder? Yeah? All right. Now, first a little bit about where I'm coming from. Of course, I've been autistic all my life, but I didn't know it before I was in my 20s, because, you know, even though I've been diagnosed with, you know, autistic disorder, it was definitely not what you would call classical autism. Especially not back in 1981, when they diagnosed me with autistic-like behavior. In my 20s, in 1995, I was diagnosed with autism on the grounds that my language development had been delayed. Back then, there was still this distinction between autism and Asperger's syndrome, and the only difference in the DSM-4 criteria, the previous ones, between autism and Asperger's syndrome is that Asperger's syndrome does not include a clinically significant language delay. Otherwise, autism and Asperger's syndrome were essentially the same. They have found that this distinction had no scientific validity, which is why they have now combined them in the DSM-5. So, I did spend most of my life being different without really knowing why, because, well, my mother was told I had autistic-like behavior, but that wasn't really meaningful at the time, and it was sort of expected I would grow out of it anyway. And it was only when my life had fallen apart that I was diagnosed. Essentially, I had nothing left to lose at that time, just to make a long story short. But long before that time, I had found an alternative way of communication. You see, I really like languages, so I learned English quite well. I'm from the Netherlands. And I started participating internationally through computers, first through bulletin board systems and then through the early internet. Now, this was in the late 80s and early 90s, so not many people were doing this. Then I was diagnosed or about to be diagnosed, and I joined on the internet a group consisting mostly of parents of children on the autistic spectrum. And another long story short, finally I ended up starting my own, which back then in 1996 was not something you could simply do with a click of a mouse button. There already was a group of run by and for autistic people, called Autism Network International, the ANI mailing list, but it was hosted by Syracuse University. I did it on my own, and it was only much later that I realized that what I ran was the first entirely self-hosted community run for and by autistic people. Now, so autistic people had started finding each other online, and the word autism became like a key for actually belonging to a community of some description for the first time in my life, even if those people could very well be on the other side of the world. And hence the idea of being autistic became embedded in my sense of identity. For better or worse, I might add. Because I do also, like Ros, find it disabling. But I also consider it inseparable from myself. Like Jim Sinclair wrote in 1993, autism is not an appendage. You can't just take it out of the person and be left with the same person just without the disabilities, because those disabilities are like the other side of many characteristics of the person. I'll discuss that later. You can't really separate that. And on those online groups, including my own, online autistic participants discovered their identity, their autistic identity, through a shared yet deeply personal exploration of what we gradually started to consider a different way of being. And some would consider it a disability, others wouldn't. But the idea that this was a different way of being was certainly widely agreed on. Hence, neurodiversity. Oh wait, I think I forgot to write. I've done this, and I've done this. Neurodiversity is simply the recognition of the fact that humans vary in neurology as they do in every other characteristic. So the idea of disagreeing with neurodiversity doesn't really make sense to me. It's like disagreeing with variety in skin color or height or personality traits. Different brains are different. This is a fact. But what's new is that we started to attach political implications to this fact. As Judy Singer wrote in 1998, based on discussions on the group I ran, we are beginning to divide ourselves according to something new, differences in kinds of minds, swinging the nature versus nurture pendulum back towards nature. Incidentally, I've got one minor peeve that I'd just like to quickly mention. There are many people who are talking about people with neurodiversity, as if neurodiversity itself is a condition, like some people are neurodiverse and others are not. This is not possible. Everyone is different. However, a person can be neurodivergent, which is like very different from the average. But neurodiversity, by definition, is a collective trait, not an individual one. So, what started to emerge then was a sense that we share certain characteristics, including certain communication characteristics, a certain way of being, a certain way of looking at the world, thinking, perceiving, related to the world. And we started having in-jokes that only we could understand, and we started, sharing these internal things, and gradually what you could call an autistic culture started to develop, which is sort of akin to deaf culture, deaf with a capital D. They have a different way of communication, which is their sign language. And they also feel that there's a shared culture around that. We start in a very similar way. We started to feel this as well. Now, in the 90s, self-advocacy became a thing, autistic people advocating for themselves. But that became more and more collective. It became just advocacy, like the self sort of appeared as autistic people started organizing themselves in group. And from that came, especially in the last decade or so, became a whole new branch of political activism on behalf of autistic people. Next, I'd like to talk a bit about stereotyping and pathologization, common stereotypes of autism. Autistic people are missing. They're not really there. They're locked up in their own prison. Like that one image you see there of that big box, that was part of a news article I found. Some non-autistic person, of course, they're never autistic, were going to lock themselves up in a box for 48 hours in some supermarket in public to raise awareness of autism. I don't even know what to say. Autism is a puzzle to solve. Autistic people are unfeeling, autistic people are violent. This one is all too common, especially in the United States recently. There's been a lot about autistic shooters. Autistic people are not fully human. And there are a few more. Like, for instance, autistic people do not form relationships. Ros Blackburn just mentioned that one. Unfortunately, she believes it. And that's called internalization. And, you know, the best way to assure that you're never going to form relationships is to believe that you're never going to form relationships. Now, I've met other autistic people, and this, in my case, has led to relationships. And I've got 3 kids now. So it is possible, even for someone diagnosed with autistic disorder. Just saying. Another stereotype I ran into today was autistic people are not worthy of the same standards as others. And the form in which I encountered that stereotype was a little complicated. I encountered it in Fred Volkmar's speech, I think it was this morning, or early this afternoon. For those of you who've seen it, you might remember he used an analogy with a parachute. He was talking about double-blind studies and randomized controlled trials. You know, these things are like the gold standard for every other kind of medical research in general. But for autism, he used this parachute analogy, like he showed a picture of a man jumping from a plane and a parachute and said, well, parachutes have never been proven by double-blind studies, and we all accept that they work. So hence, we should just accept, you know, autism research based on lesser scientific standards than the gold standard, which is randomized controlled trials and double-blind studies. And the parachute analogy is incredibly flawed. For a while, I didn't even know how to start explaining that. But really, you know, if you jump from a plane without a parachute, you're dead, just to state the obvious. If you don't give your autistic child ABA, the worst thing that could possibly happen is that they stay autistic. Now, if you consider that to be equivalent to falling off a plane without a parachute, then you're not really into acceptance, are you? Pathologization. Now, the stereotypes I mentioned earlier are all very pathologizing. Like autistic people are very pathological. Let's turn this on its head. You non-autistic people, you have something I'd like to call social dependency disorder. You have a severe lack of exactness in communication. For example, a very loose relationship with the truth. White lies galore. I never know where I've got you guys. You have severe impairments in independence, especially when you form groups. You all think alike. Groupthink, often leading to collective destructiveness. And I'm not just talking about football hooligans either. I'm talking about things like war, death, destruction, all because people conform in groups. Severe impairments in rigor of thought, base rate neglect, confirmation bias, prejudice, superstition, you name it. Now, I'm not saying autistic people are immune to that, but we do tend to be slightly more logical on the average. And another thing about stereotyping and pathologization. I found this in my conference folder. This is an autistic notebook, it says. Like, oh great, they thought of me. Every page is different. What? How is this autistic? And so I open it and go, random squiggles. This is chaos. Now, the normal regular notebooks, you know, where every page is the same, where it's nice and straight and lined up, those are the autistic ones. This one's for you normals. Now, back in '98, there was this fantastic site called the Institute for the Study of the Neurologically Typical, and it took this to great lengths, and you can still find it in the Internet Archive, and there's a reference on my slides if you download them. So, what is autism anyway? There is no one thing called autism, says science, or at least says this study by Waterhouse, London, and Gilbert. The ASD diagnosis lacks biological and construct validity. However, I find that most autistic people do seem to have something important and fundamental in common, because it seems like we really needed this label to get together. It was, for me, an essential key. For many, many, many autistic people, it was this essential key to finally achieving some sort of community and self-understanding. So clearly, we need it. Now, I can't quite put my finger on it, what it is that we have in common, but clearly there's something. Now, there was once a statistician, a very famous one, who said all models are wrong, but some are useful. Now, autism is a sort of model. It's a bit like a stereotype, really. But for the time being, it's a very useful one, even if eventually it might turn out to be wrong and to be replaced by something else. Disability. Now, I can be short about this because others have already talked about that. Social model versus the medical model. The social model basically means that all the adaptations should be done by society, and the medical model means that this disabled person should be doing all the changing and conforming as much as necessary, and should basically be fixed. Now, by definition, as I pointed out already, all models have limited validity, like all models are wrong, but some are useful. So there's a risk of over-application. You know, some people are totally into the social model. Many autistic self-advocates are, many autistic advocates. Others are totally into the medical model. Many doctors are. Really what you need is a combination of both. Now, is it possible to be autistic without being disabled? That's an interesting question for which, unfortunately, I have no time. But the short answer is I don't really know. Anyway, but what I do know is that every coin has two sides, and that with autistic impairments comes strength. Like with communication impairments comes enhanced directness. Like you really know where you have us. We're not going to do the social white lie thing on you. With social impairments comes, you know, enhanced honesty and independence. With rigidity comes enhanced detailed perception. You know, with monotropic attention span, a monotropic attention span means you really can only pay attention to one thing at the same time. You can't really perceive anything else if you're really concentrating on something, but that does mean that your concentration is really enhanced. With sensory issues may come an enhanced sensitivity, which in certain contexts can be good. So, something about cure versus acceptance. Basically, the gold standard of the pro-cure people is applied behavioral modification or intensive behavioral intervention. It is claimed that this is the only treatment for which there is valid scientific evidence. Recently, there has actually been a study that says that it's with Gilberg again on the list of names, which said that ABA, at least in Sweden, was not any more effective than any other form of treatment. I haven't had time to incorporate that here yet because it's only just out. Anyway, the overriding goal of ABA treatment is to make the autistic kid indistinguishable from their peers. I always found that very interesting because they never asked that of non-autistic children. Like in non-autistic children, difference is celebrated, but autistic children all have to conform and all be indistinguishable and all be the same. No, thank you. Now, how, on the other hand, what is cure really? It depends on how radically autistic someone is. Like for someone like Ros Blackburn, it's clear, like she's severely autistic. But what if you're only just over the line? Do you want to make them like totally neurotypical, or do you want to make them just normal enough that they can pass? How much would it take to push them to the other side of the line? And that question is very complicated because that line is not thin and sharp. It's really thick and fuzzy. So really, cure cannot be defined properly. Acceptance. Now, I've already mentioned, Jim Sinclair wrote that you can't really separate the autism from the person. However, experiences on that do vary. I doubt Ross would agree with me here, or with Jim Sinclair. But, like I said, autism is not one thing. Maybe Ross has biologically something completely different from me. I don't know. Gunilla Gerland mentioned that she may never have had autism at all. She may have had this strep infection called PANDAS, and which made her act autistic, which of course, since autism is diagnosed behaviorally, means by definition you're autistic, but it's all very confusing. Anyway, acceptance definitely involves respect for personal choice, and that is lacking on all sides of this debate. Like, the anti-cure people want everyone to be anti-cure, the pro-cure people want everyone to be pro-cure. I'm saying, let people just do what they want. And everyone needs acceptance, even those who wish for a cure, even those who don't accept themselves. Now, how much time have we left?
You don't have any time.
Conclusions.
Sorry, we've
You
still
can
got
read them for yourself then. The idea of curing it is a fallacy. People have already said this, so I don't need to say it again. References, and here's my email address. Thank you.
Damian works for the National Autistic Society as Head of Autism Knowledge and Expertise for the adults and community, and as a researcher for London South Bank University. Damian's interest in autism began when his son was diagnosed in 2005 as autistic at the age of 2. Damian himself was diagnosed with Asperger's in 2009 at the age of 36. Damian.
Hello everyone. As you can see from the picture on my opening slide, I guess you can tell which side of this debate I'm going to be coming from. As been said earlier, is autism the kind of thing that can be cured in the first place? Or maybe if it's a stereotype, maybe it can. Interventions are often sold as if a miracle treatment, and if not, as the only recognised approach to be scientifically proven, which I've put in inverted commas there because that's not really how science works, and needed as quickly as possible in order not to miss the window of opportunity. I've also put that in inverted commas because helping an autistic person goes throughout life. Creating opportunities goes throughout life. And a lot of this rhetoric around miracle treatments and windows of opportunity, I find exploitative of both autistic people, but particularly families. As a parent myself, when my son was diagnosed at the age of 2, I was given a lot of very negative stuff around autism, and a lot of stuff around came off the internet and his mum looked up, all this kind of stuff of what a parent needed to do. And it filled us both with quite a lot of anxiety about the future and what was happening to our child. This wasn't really helpful, but it certainly sells a lot of copy, if you like, if you're trying to sell families this story. So what would help autistic people and their family? What is it that we're trying to intervene with? What can be changed and what can't? So in this presentation, I'm just going to mainly use some quotes to highlight different approaches. So starting off with a more normative approach, in my view, this is a quote from Richard Hastings, an academic working in this country. Another way to decide what to teach a child with autism is to understand typical child development. We should ask what key developmental skills the child has already developed, and what they need to learn next. If you look at this opening part of this quote, it's asking people to compare the autistic child developmentally to the normal child. And in a sense, what needs to be developed is what the gap is between the two. This is highly normative as an approach. And it continues, then there are pivotal behaviours that would help further development, teaching communication, social skills, daily living, or academic skills that can support longer-term independence and choices. This last part seems fair enough, you could argue. But there's many ways of interpreting this. And I highlighted some of the comments Jonathan made earlier. Developmental progress, same outcomes, improving social development. What does this actually mean for an autistic person? Does it mean making eye contact, to make an obvious example? Does it mean masking and passing in social life as if you're not autistic? And what's common to this purpose, if you follow this logic through, is it being indistinguishable from one's peers for all intents and purposes? And what effect can that have on the individual? This is a quote from 20 years ago from Donna Williams, an autistic woman living in Australia. I had virtually no socially shared nor consciously, intentionally expressed personhood beyond this performance of a non-autistic normality with which I had neither comprehension, connection, nor identification. This disconnected, constructed facade was accepted by the world around me when my true and connected self was not. Each spoonful of its acceptance was a shovelful of dirt on the coffin in which my real self was being buried alive. So, when pushed too far, some of these ideas can have a very damaging effect on someone's sense of selfhood. So we've got to be really careful with how we're intervening in with what. In a sense, what this is highlighting is what in a psychology and sociology is often described as this disjuncture between a sense of I subjectively and me, how other people see me externally. And people have linked this to teenage crisis, psychological crisis, linked it with social stigma and many other negative aspects if there's a big gap between these two things. And this is a rather long conceptual term, but I brought it up earlier today in another talk, the idea of psycho-emotional disableism. This was a concept that a couple of disability studies academics came up with and have worked on. And it's a way that people are psychologically and emotionally disabled by the social situations and cultures that they live in. So in an autistic unfriendly world, we are being psychologically and emotionally disabled as well as disabled in other more physical and concrete ways. And I think this kind of internalized self-negativity is a massive problem for a lot of people. So, moving on to a more social model of approach, Micheline Mason is not autistic, but I find her work very informative around disability, and I find this quote around the social model quite powerful. Because most of us are not ill at all, but have injuries or genetic conditions of a permanent nature, the goal of getting better is impossible to achieve. But changing the way we are treated as disabled people is possible. Therefore, the social model is full of hope for us. So that gives you a good understanding, I hope, of why disabled people find the social model that much more empowering a way of looking at disability. The concept of neurodiversity, seeing neurological development as part of natural diversity, I say it very much is. If you think suffering, disease and death is part of nature too. Not all of life is a positive experience. Saying something is part of natural diversity is just that. And rather than something to be pathologized using a purely medical model of disability, defined by one's deviation from statistical or idealized norms of what someone should be like. So the idea of the kind of a normal person, is anyone here perfectly normal in every sense? If you are, you're probably very abnormally normal. So it doesn't really make any sense. So this, by following these ideas, is not to say that those who identify as autistic or other forms of neuroidentity do not find life challenging. Autistic people are significantly disadvantaged in many aspects of life. And this is part of acceptance to me. So acceptance and linking that idea with neglect is really weird to my understanding. If someone was to say they accept their non-autistic child, I'd think they are accepting them for their core characteristics and their personality, their interests. If they were not accepting their non-autistic child as they were, what would that mean? So in terms of what people is saying when they use the term acceptance, it certainly does not mean neglect. So this is probably entering more into the sort of green area of what Virginia was talking about earlier, a more pragmatic approach. And this is from Richard Mills from Research Autism. We need to see the world from the autistic perspective and apply approaches based on a mutuality of understanding that are rational and ethical, which respect the right of the individual to be different, yet recognises and deals with distress and offers practical help. We should encourage and motivate the person to develop strengths rather than focus on deficits. This will mean offering opportunity for development while supporting emotional stability. In terms of the sort of ethical decisions that people make of when to intervene, when not, as a parent, we're making these decisions all the time, every day. And as practitioners, we are as well. And it's not an easy thing to do, and we're going to make mistakes with the people we work with, I'd say. So don't beat yourself up too much about all of this as well. Earlier today, I did a talk in a symposium about my doctoral thesis and the findings that came out. And what I looked at was the diversity of views regarding educational interventions. And this graph here is a very simplified version of what I talked about earlier. But basically it showed in my findings that there was a kind of shift in ideology towards a more behaviourist approach by non-autistic parents. And there was a shift towards a kind of radical and pupil-led, person-focused approach amongst autistic adults. And the practitioners, the red line there, had a kind of more eclectic view in the middle between the two. But digging beneath why people choose one approach or another tells us a great deal more. This first quote here comes from a mother of 2 children on the spectrum, one with Asperger's, one with more classical autism and learning disabilities. And talking about that child, she said, because otherwise he is trapped in a world where he cannot communicate his hopes and fears, particularly when I am dead and cannot look out for him. Now, amongst many of the parental accounts, to me, depressingly, there was a lot of negativity around the idea of social change. So there was many comments about society won't change for us, therefore I have to make my child kind of more resilient to an unfriendly world, if you like. Especially when I'm no longer there to look out for them. So, in a sense, what happens when the only advocacy they've got is no longer there anymore? They're going to have to advocate for themselves. It's that kind of push towards changing the child to make them stronger at dealing with the world. So if you understand some of these reasons why people are taking these approaches, you get a better understanding and some level of where we could communicate over. This second quote is from an autistic adult who had the kind of very radical, critical pedagogy view of education and said, difference should be accommodated, accepted and celebrated. So acceptance is in that quote, celebrating individual difference and the strengths as well as the difficulties, is celebrating life. So, a better way forward. Understanding of different dispositions, a building of relationships in a respectful manner, engaging with an individual's abilities and interests and not just what they find difficult. Is this not how many people, whatever their disposition, would like to be treated? So, in terms of next steps, to me, what's needed is building more collaborative networks and communities of practice. That means not working in silos, so parent groups over here, academics over there, practitioners somewhere else, and autistic people over the hill and far away. You know, this needs to be brought together, and that means also respecting and valuing different forms of expertise. So, valuing insider knowledge, and that means often, I would say, paying for that knowledge too. a lot of people may have jobs that might help them pay to come and do a talk at a conference like this. If you're an unemployed autistic person, that's rather more difficult. So we've got to look at the payment of expertise as well, and I'm including families in that too. As part of that, I would say earlier today we held a meeting for autistic delegates this morning, and there's some feedback from that meeting, a few sort of flip chart paper that we've put up hopefully now in the poster area of the conference. So I'd ask you all to have a look at what the autistic people here are trying to say to all of you working in the field. And along those collaborative lines, I'm currently chairing a group based at London South Bank University called the Participatory Autism Research Collective, which is looking to do exactly this. Unfortunately, it's not currently funded, although I have recently put in a funding bid for it. So I hope, fingers crossed on that one. So that's everything.
Do we have ladies with microphones or gentlemen with microphones? There's one just there. I think the idea is to go and speak to that.
Yeah, so I'll try to be as very quick as possible. So my name is Damian Milton. I'm from the charity Ambitious About Autism, and I also have autism myself. I've actually got a very quick question to ask all of you, or the entire panel. It only requires a one-word answer, and also a question that I hope the audience, I really want you to consider as well. So first things first, so before I have autism, that makes me a very special, very unique person, but it also gives me a lot of issues and problems as well. On the whole, I would say mostly my experience just tends to be from the negative side to the positive side. Now, I think it was Ros earlier who was talking about autism being a genetic, having roots in genetics and that not being solved. Now, 2 years ago, and I've got the acronym up here, 2 years ago there was a major breakthrough that may not work, but it's still a breakthrough called the Clustered Regular Interspace Short Palindromic Repeats, known as CRISPR. Now, without going into the science of it, essentially, if it does work, that means that gene editing could become cheap, easy, and normal. So let's take a hypothetical situation. In 60 years' time, let's say CRISPR does work, and you could choose the personality traits, so you could choose the traits as an exhibition of your children. To the panel and to the audience, if you could choose, if it was discovered that your child had autistic traits and you could choose, would you include those traits into your child, or would you get rid of them?
Right, who would like to go first?
Can I also answer in slightly more than one word? Before I had my son, I probably would have gone through antenatal testing, and I might well have made a decision based on all the negative information and advice that comes out about disability. I might have made a decision to change the genetic composition of my forthcoming child. Through having had my son, who also has profound learning difficulties, and through having met other people with autism and so on, I'm really, really, really glad such a test wasn't available, because I wouldn't change him for the world. What I would also say, though, is that his medical problems, if there'd been a genetic test for those, yes, I would have got rid of them immediately. Can I just say one more thing? A friend of mine, her son had autism and epilepsy, and he also tragically died of leukemia. And a colleague of hers who was a born-again Christian was trying to comfort her and said, just think, maybe now in heaven he doesn't have leukemia, he doesn't have autism, and he doesn't have epilepsy. And she said, yeah, you can take the leukemia, you can take the epilepsy, but he better still be autistic.
Jonathan.
Me? It's a good question, and I agree with the others. Good question. It really is hypothetical, though, because, as I said in my opening comments, there isn't a gene for autism, and there isn't going to be a simple gene editing procedure that's going to be able to, quote, take autism away. It just isn't like that. Autism is highly heritable, but there are so many different gene effects on all our personalities and different traits. We all have heritable traits. And so the idea that you can do a little bit of gene splicing and take something away is just, it's sort of medical mythology, you know. But it's a thought experiment. I do accept that. And my honest answer, it depends on the extent of the traits. That's the honest answer. So to some extent, I would celebrate a degree of autism traits. I disagree with Ros. There are, in my experience, different degrees. But severely disabling, handicapping autism, I wouldn't want that for my child now.
Thank you. Martijn.
But some traits, yeah, fantastic.
Okay. Next, Martijn, please.
Right. You said this was a simple yes or no question. I completely disagree with that. This is like one of the most complicated and hard to answer questions I've ever been asked, and I'm really glad I already have 3 children. And what I can tell you is that my 3 children are all happy with their lives. My oldest is 14. I've asked her, does she mind being autistic? She says no. It's, she does have some problems, but we've never made a problem of the autism in our family, and therefore it's not really experienced as such. And I think it is much more useful to tackle specific problems that the person is experiencing, quite apart from whether they're autistic or not, and try to solve those specific problems. And well, if hypothetical genetic engineering of that type were available, then I would hope that it would target very specific problematic traits and not something super general and varied as autism, because I would not agree with that.
Okay. Damian.
Whilst there's things such as being dyspraxic or getting sensory overload and things which can be a real pain in the backside to live with, quite frankly, I wouldn't change my son for all the tea in China, and all of those expressions. And he is diagnosed autistic, severe learning disabilities, global developmental delay, all of that. I wouldn't swap him for any other child, and I'm as happy as could be to have him in my life. And so, would I change him? No.
Can I ask for a quick show of hands, those who would be interested in this kind of scientific technology that might allow us to choose what kind of child we have and without autism? Anybody in the audience want to put their hands up for positive for that? Okay, and everybody who wouldn't choose that? Right. And can I just quickly ask anybody be neutral and not put their hand up? Could they put their hand up now? People? Yeah. So I think it's pretty close between against it and still not quite sure. So I think the debate is still very open. Now, I'd like to know if there are any other questions. And for anybody, that gentleman there, it's very quick. Blue shirt.
We're in line up here.
There's a line up there, and there's a gentleman over there. Okay. Gentleman in the red jumper first, because you're by the microphone. You win.
Okay. Well, thank you. I'm Stephen Shore. I am autistic. I'm a professor of special education at Adelphi University. There's so many questions that come from this discussion. If we're able to dial characteristics through genetics, who makes the decision as to which characteristics we choose? How do we make this decision? Who is authorized to make the decision? I don't know if I have the answers, but I certainly have the questions. I think what we need to do is we need to move away from the deficit model of autism. So often we hear these are all the things that autistic people cannot do. The diagnostic procedure is based on what people on the spectrum cannot do. The educational procedures are based on the weaknesses, the challenges, and they are there, they are significant. There are some significant challenges to having autism. This is why we're here, trying to figure it out.
Mr. Shaw, can I ask the question, please?
Oh, sorry. No, it was a comment.
I know, but we're actually asking for questions right now.
All right. I'll be really fast. The comment is that we need to be asking what can autistic people do and focus on that, while at the same time using intervention, of which we have multiples, in order to help people on the spectrum be the best autistic people we can be.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Just quickly, I think if you're not looking at strengths, or if you're not looking at the challenges and difficulties someone's going through, then either way, you're not looking at them holistically, so you're missing a trick and missing part of the picture. So you have to look at both, really, to put it simply.
Okay. Anyone else from the panel want to speak to that? Virginia?
I think there are wider values in society we have to look at here, because it is very arbitrary as to what qualities in people we do and don't value. I liked Martijn's arrows of two sides of the coin. And I think our society often celebrates some qualities that aren't pleasant and undervalues qualities that are good. And I think a lot of the autistic strengths are in the field of ethics, actually, in terms of being less dependent on peers' opinion and that sort of thing. So it's complicated.
Right, thank you. Now, I'm very aware of time, but if someone has another urgent question.
I have a quick one.
A quick one.
Quick one is, where are all the people with autism at this conference? Where are all the people? Yeah, there's your token 2 or 3.
No,
Excuse me. Where are all the families with the children coming here to be trained? Where are they? And my second question is, do we think here in Europe that we know better and we're the specialists and the families don't know anything? I'm a person with Asperger's who runs a program all over the US for kids on the spectrum. But guess what? If you go to a conference in the US, half of the attendees are families, children, and young people on the spectrum. I think you're missing the boat. I said this 8 years ago here. It hasn't changed. So that's my question.
Right.
Excuse me?
Yes.
Well, excuse me, sir. If you turned your head, you might be looking at somebody with autism.
I'm aware.
I'm also pretty, I've also done the talk radio show. I've done so many amazing things as well, and I've got to be honest with you, I'm a little bit annoyed with the negativity of that, to be quite honest with you.
Okay. I think there are actually quite a lot of people here, but this is not particularly a conference for training families. I think there are other conferences that do that. Anyway, do we have any other questions particular to this debate? Yes? There? Okay. Last question, because I feel we should...
You hear me?
Yes, we should be winding
Perfect.
up.
Okay, I'm a person with Asperger myself, and also a researcher in neuroscience, and an advocate, and the vice president of an association of therapists. And I just want to do a remark, and maybe it will follow an answer from you. Many of you talked about ABA, Denver model, and many models, putting them into the debate about acceptance and cure. But I don't think that is appropriate, because a method is just a method. I teach ABA, and I teach ABA to my Asperger daughter in order to help her interact using ABA with neurotypical children. She learned that way a useful method of interaction. We have ABA therapists that have Asperger syndrome and that use ABA on children with Asperger or autism. I think that a method is just a method. I think it's more important to teach people who you will use ABA, Denver model, or any other model about ethics. So the question is it really appropriate to make a distinction about the methodology? And is not more appropriate to do a proper ethical education to people who will use those methods? Thank you.
Thank you. Virginia is pretty expert on ABA, and I think Damian also wants to speak.
You've highlighted two really important points. One is we have to distinguish between the goals of an approach and the process. And I think critics of ABA have sometimes assumed that ABA practitioners always want to so-called recover or make people indistinguishable from their peers. And in my experience, a lot of ABA practitioners would be horrified to have that as a goal, but do want to enable people to acquire strengths. But the second thing I think we have to look at across all interventions, and this is an ethical issue, is, as I think Jonathan said as well, are there harms in the process? Are there benefits in the process? Do we use methods that might cause a bit of discomfort for long-term goals? How long-term do the goals have to be to justify it? This is all about ethics, and we all, whatever method we use, need to engage much more in these sorts of reflections.
Damian, do you need to? Oh, Jonathan's not spoken much, but...
Yes, ABA is a method, or several methods. I see it more as a theory with lots of methods coming out of that theory. It's not really my favourite theory for a number of reasons, but you're right to point out how methods are implemented in practice and the ethics and intentions of what they're being put to in many ways is more important than elements of the process. I mean, elements of the process can follow certain ethical decisions. For example, practice I've seen is kind of ignoring behaviour that you don't want to reinforce, and that can sometimes be very distressing for a child. And I'm not saying all ABA therapists do that, but sometimes the way a theory or method is being implemented is part of the problem rather than the overall theory itself. And it goes back to what I was talking about earlier about building those mutuality of understanding, so we're working towards goals that are actually going to be more beneficial for that individual rather than imposed on them, thinking it will be good for them when maybe it won't be. And so.
Okay, Jonathan.
Yes, I wanted just to respond to say, to agree with you that the ethics and the motivation of the practitioner are equally and often more important than the, quotes, method, which are often artificially polarized. You know, many of these methods have many things in common. I also wanted to say that the emphasis on strengths, I think, would be totally core to most intervention that I'm aware of. And the transactional account that I was trying to describe, you know, I think speaks to that in the sense that one of the young people, early teens that I remember working with, working hard with his depression at not being able to communicate and fit in with what he saw as his peer group in a mainstream school. The work was both with him on understanding his own process, but also with the school to understand him. And the outcome was that at a school prize giving, when he was around 16, a few years later, he got a prize, and all the other kids went up for the prize in maths or whatever it was. And he was called up, and he got a prize for being him. And I thought that was just a wonderful outcome of the work with the school and the young person to get into a valued situation. That's what we hope for in the interventions.
Right. Okay, I'm very aware it's 6:30 and we should be clearing the hall. I think it's been a fascinating debate and a great afternoon. Thank you very much, Virginia, Jonathan, Martijn, Damian and Ros, and thank you all for coming.